Okay, welcome to a bit of curiosity. Today we've got Ben Light on here. Ben is an operations specialist turned extreme endurance athlete. After spending years working in telecom, Ben got himself more into ultra running, which is anything longer than a marathon. Currently, he's married with 3 children living in Utah. When he's not with family or running, he owns a coaching and speaking business called Adventure Your Potential. His business is focused on helping others unlock their hidden potential through his defined process. Through this methodology, he has successfully completed several events over 300 miles in a single push. He has successfully built a career around his passion as a sponsored athlete, endurance coach, personal trainer, brand consultant, and motivational speaker. So right off the bat, Ben, it's quite a bio. Let's just dive right into it, right? Like, what is it like to push yourself to the extremes and to run 300 miles in one push?
What is it like? I guess you got to be pretty okay with being uncomfortable because it's not the most comfortable feeling, but it's very rewarding. I mean, why would anybody continue to strive to raise their bar, when you're pushing through a level of discomfort, if there wasn't some type of rainbow or pot of gold on the other side of weathering the storm. And for me, it's just, what can I do? I've always had that question. It's with a driving force deep within is like, well, can I do that? Like when you see somebody do something epic, and there's people doing epic things all the time. And what's special about them versus me? Do they have some superpower, or, you know, do they have a dream? Do they believe that they're capable of it, and they wanted to go out and try to achieve it and see if they're perfectly capable of it? And that's kind of like that driving force behind myself. Is I had two loves. One was the outdoors and one was fitness. And when I found ultra running, it was kind of marrying those two loves together. And ultimately it created a third love. And that was, what am I personally capable of? So that human achievement, and problem solving and achieving.
Yeah, so 300 miles, like, I think, I don't know. It's kind of unfathomable to a lot of people. A lot of people that are going to pull up this podcast, going to listen to it, they may have heard of the ultra running community. Really, we're not a running podcast, right? We're focused on just questions and learning and growth. And so with that, right, like you look at what 300 miles, like, do you sleep? Like, what does that look like? What do you eat during that? Like, you've got all the questions, right? Like, as I've done a 50 miler. That's the furthest I've gone, but I'm married to a woman that's done several 100 miler races, right? But it's a whole nother animal when you stretch it. Like, well, okay, for most people, 100 miles is a whole nother animal. We're talking about 4 marathons, like, consecutively without sleep, right? But when you do 300 miles, what does that look like?
Well, it looks like 50 miles times six. That's what
Well,
it looks
okay, fair. Yeah.
It's just
So,
like doing it. I mean, it's just a little bit longer. So like, obviously I didn't just go out the door one day and go, I'm going to run 300 miles. It's like that, if anybody's ever progressed in any type of activity or maybe hobby, it's like, how much, you've gone this far. Can I go just a little bit further? And it's like baby steps over a few year process, like mini wins and continuing to raise the bar and problem solving to get the next distance and the next distance. And truly, once you hit a certain level, I guess, or a certain distance, or whatever a person's, personal challenge of growth is they start to learn that there actually is no limit. There truly is. There's truly no limit. And it just does. Is it possible? And does the math add up? And I'm a very big numbers math person. And if there's something that you're trying to go for and a goal that you're trying to achieve, is it possible? And do you believe in that you can achieve it? That's the most important thing. It's your attitude towards yourself and the goal. And I think there's a lot of goals out there that each of us have, and we wonder if we could do it. It's just finding the the courage and the drive and that pursuit of working towards it and investing the time and in developing the ability to do it.
Yeah, for sure. No, that makes sense. It's well, I want to come back to some of that stuff, but we got to get the big elephant out of the room. Like, I think everybody's wondering, okay, 300 miles, like that's a lot, right? Like, A, how many days does that take you? And then B, what do you think about during that when you're running 300 miles?
We could spend a whole entire podcast on the whole thinking about, because you got a lot to think about. It's 300 miles, and
It's a long way. Yeah.
the length of
But
time that it takes you is determined on a lot of outside elements, internally and externally. So obviously, pace determines, and your fitness determines speed, and then your pace also is determined by your environment that you're running through. So are you on a trail? How smooth it is? Technical will dictate pace. Uphill, downhill, flat will dictate pace. So when you're going 300 miles, it's very hard to find a straight 300 miles unless you live in like the Midwest or something like that in the flatlands and stuff. And maybe you
for
can run
sure.
flat for 300 miles. But here in Utah, you're going to run into something that's going to be vertical or that's going to take you up and down. And the two different times that I've ran over 300 miles had a lot of vertical gain and loss to it. And so for me, they've roughly came in right around the same time frame. It took me about 10 hours, a little over 110 hours to do that. So that comes out to like 4.5 days
Yeah,
to complete that. And obviously, over those 4.5 days, um, the first time was my Wasatch Tahoe project, where I ran the Wasatch 100 and flew over to Tahoe and ran the Tahoe 200. And still, the 4.5 days, I slept for probably roughly 3 total hours out of those 4.5 days. And then the second time I ran it was our Utah Brawl route. We created a route that went from Bear Lake all the way down to Soldier Hollow. And it also took us just over 110 hours. And we there slept, I would have to say, close to 3 hours max as well. Like probably you're going to say about an hour each night, roughly, cat nap
yeah.
to bleed off that melatonin that's building up on the brain.
What does that do to your sanity? But
Oh, well, I'll tell you what, if you want to lose your mind, if you want to see somebody lose their mind, don't sleep. So sleep, that
absolutely,
melatonin building up in the brain, it can really alter a person's thought process and reality process. And I've seen some pretty crazy things from other runners that go into a very heavy sleep deprivation. But for myself, I've had some pretty unique experiences when I hit that sleep deprivation. And it's always good to always have a buddy running with you to keep things in perspective and to keep you safe. But getting to your second part of your question on what do you think about, I typically think of really bad ideas to do, again. So just to give you I paint a picture. When I say bad ideas, that means another grand idea or another great adventure. Because so in 2017, I was running a series of 200-mile races called the Triple Crown of 200s. And it's 3 races. At the time, they were roughly 6 weeks, in a total of six weeks apart from each other. So you would run a race and have 3 weeks, and then run another race and have 3 weeks and run the third race. So in a 6 week time frame, you ran 600 miles. And on the very first of those races, I was probably coming close to the last like 35 miles of the race. And I was running by myself, and I caught one of my buddies, one of my really good friends, Mike, and we started running together. And I started talking to him about what idea I was having. I was deep in thought, and I was kind of running the numbers. And this is the scenario is like, so I live in Utah, and there is a race here called the Wasatch 100, a
Yeah.
very popular old school 100-mile race here. And it lands on the exact same day as the Tahoe 200 out in Lake Tahoe.
Yeah.
And the Tahoe 200 is part of that race series of the three 200-mile races. And it was going to be the next race after this race that I was currently in called the Bigfoot 200 up in the Pacific Northwest. And so we were getting to the end of this, and I told Mike, I said, hey, Mike, I got this idea. Like the Tahoe and the Wasatch start the exact same day, the exact same morning, but they're in two different states. And I just said, I can run the Tahoe 200 and have in 70 hours. And so I have actually 30 extra hours to spare. Now, could I run another 100 miles in those 30 hours? And I was like, what if I ran the Wasatch 100 because it starts first and it's a shorter time frame. You only have 36 hours to finish it. So if I ran that in under 30 hours and then somehow took a flight from Utah over to Lake Tahoe and started the Tahoe 200 that actually had started the day before, the same day
Right.
as my 100-mile race, and started that, could I finish it in its allotted time frame? Could I get 300 miles in the same time as that race gives other runners to do it to do 200 miles?
And remind me, I think you just said it, but what was the time cutoff for the Tahoe 200?
Oh, 105 hours.
Okay.
And so technically, if I was to finish in 30 hours at Wasatch, I can actually have 35 hours. And then there's an hour, obviously, time difference between Utah, Mountain Time and Pacific Time. So actually,
Right.
it's, 36 hours.
Okay.
So I was giving me a little buffer. And obviously, there's some travel time to go. And I was like, there's no way you can drive. Obviously, it's a 10-hour drive. So that's not going to work out. So I was like, well, where the Wasatch 100 finishes, it finishes right by the Heber Airport. And I was like, over by Tahoe, there's the Truckee Airport. And then I found out it's about a 2-hour flight. So I ended up doing this. Back up for a second. I'm saying this to Michael at the end of his first 200-mile race. And we're about 175 miles into this. And he's in some discomfort, let's just say. And I'm restating this idea where here we are running 200 miles and I got this idea of running 300 miles. And basically he turns to me and says, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard.
Well,
like,
I think that's where most people would go, right? Like most people are 120 miles into a 200 mile. Well, most people don't run that far for one, right? But if we were that far, most of our brains are going to be like, get me out of this. Like my feet are sore, my muscles, my joints, everything aches. Not thinking, okay, how can I just cram in 300 miles here
how
in
can
the
you
like?
level it up,
Nah,
And
that's crazy. That's impressive.
yeah, so and that's a perfect example of kind of there's other things you're thinking about. Obviously, you want to be present. You're thinking about your nutrition. You're doing it, when an airplane's flying or when a race car's racing, there's system checks that it's doing every second. It's watching, and the driver is watching the fuel. It's watching the temperature gauge. It's watching its tires. It's paying attention to everything because it has to be present and watch everything now because they have to play the long game. So a runner is thinking about his gait. He's thinking about, should I run this? Should I walk this? How hard do I push? Where am I at? Am I on course? Have I seen a flag? Did I daydream and go off course? Am I on the right route? Also, how long has it been since I eaten? How much energy I have? So you're doing these mental system checks all the time. So those are
Yeah.
always there. So when you say, what are you thinking about? Those things are just a byproduct of running 200 miles. So those things are going regardless.
Sure.
Then
It's like breathing at that point.
yeah,
So yeah.
it is. And because you've been doing it on all your training runs and everything like that. So the next thing is, what do you think about? So one of the things that I do is I don't listen to music when I run until the nighttime. So during the
Okay.
day, I have scenery, I have trail and everything like that. But when you compartmentalize back down to just a spotlight at night with your headlamp, you're kind of like, there's nothing to see. And so when just like when you're driving through the night on a long drive somewhere across the country, you start staring at right in front of you and you start to get tunnel vision. Well, you don't want that. So you want to keep more present because that's actually going to make you really tired and fall asleep. And
Yep.
falling asleep at the wheel is dangerous. Falling asleep while you're running is dangerous as just as well. And so I'll actually pop on music in the middle of the night to kind of keep my mind, you know, on some other things to keep the beat and stuff like that. That's the first night. Now, the second night, when you've run through the first night and you're going into the second night, well, music starts to get old. You need something more entertaining. So, one of the other things I do as a trick that I've learned over the years is I actually download stand up comedy and I'll actually listen to stand up comedy. One, it changes my mood. I like to laugh. And anytime you change your frequency or your attitude or your mood, you can actually generate extra energy that you don't even realize that you had. Your mood and your attitude actually affects energy. So when you're happy and somebody's joking and laughing, you're excited and you got all this energy. But when you're depressed or sad and everything like that, you get tired. It's draining. It's like a stressful feeling. So it's the same way when you're running, and people might not think about that, but your attitude and what you focus on can be a huge result in the pace that you're running and how fast you're going. And ultimately, if you're going to finish or not, comes down to your attitude. So I'll actually turn on some stand-up comedy, laugh, be involved with like what the comedian's story he's talking about or the jokes and stuff like that. And it lifts my spirit and actually my pace will pick up and it carries me a little bit through the second night. And so that's another thing that I kind of think about. But I'm usually like trying to solve world hunger and peace around the world. Yeah, not necessarily like that, but I'm thinking of like other ideas,
Yeah.
products. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I'm thinking about home and maybe trying to solve problems within internally with family and work and just random things. And then when you come across other runners, it's always good to shift your focus up from yourself onto them and see if they're okay and if they're going through any issues and maybe lift their spirits or if they're having some physical ailments to help problem solve, to help remedy those, to help them be successful at their challenge as well.
I think, yeah, that's awesome. I think right there and previously, like you pointed out some really interesting things, some really good things, right? Like a lot of us, we want to achieve whatever, right? Like I don't know how many of us listening to this are ever going to want to run 200 miles or 300 miles, right? Like I don't even, I used to think I wanted to run 100 miles. I think that day is gone from me. I think I'm done. I'm past that now. 50 miles, like, okay, I checked that box. I'm content. I don't need to go further than that. There's some other things that I do want to do, right? Like, but over an extended period of time. Like I've always wanted to do soft rock, which is essentially the hard rock course over 4 days, right? Like it's 100 miles, but doing it in 25 miles a day, I think that could be doable, right? Like for me, in where I'm at, right? Like doing the John Muir Trail, take 7 to 10 days to go do the 216 miles, right? Like stuff like that. Okay, like it's pushing it, but there's also other aspects where a lot of this stuff relates really well, and it could be whether I'm going to start a business or whether I need to improve my marriage or I want to buy my first home, whatever that looks like, right? Like I can apply a lot of these principles to that. And I love the concept that you bring up as finding joy and laughter, right? Like and how that helps kind of take your mind off of it. But then I really go to the next thing that you talked about, and that was serving others, right? Like, and that's one thing that I've always loved about the ultra racing community, the ultra running community, is that out there, you're all out in the same crazy adventure. It's not, you're not there to jump or step over the other person. Like if somebody's struggling, you're gonna hand them your gel, and it might be your last gel, right? Like you're gonna pick them up off the floor. You're gonna encourage them to, hey, like the aid station's just another couple miles up here. Like keep going. And there's a lot of opportunities to serve each other, and it brings this just great tight knit community feel to the ultra running world. And I feel like I see it, the further the distance is, the more that is accentuated, right? And you talk about like, okay, while I'm out there, I'm thinking about solving world hunger or what, right? Like, and that could be for real, right? Like, and but the only way that we're going to solve those problems is coming together as a community to seek for changes in those problems, right? And it's just like, okay, the only way I'm going to make it to 200 miles is if I have help. And like, because you look at like you and Mike are running this race together, right? Like you're feeding off of each other. And oftentimes in these longer races, you're gonna have a pacer, you're gonna have crew, you're gonna have like there's not a lot of times that anybody's doing it truly self-supported. Sometimes it happens, right? Like, but it's not that often. It's usually within a community, right? Like whether it's family helping or friends or the greater running community as a whole. And I think that's fascinating. So talk to us a little bit, Ben, like as you look at like as we look at 300 miles or 200 miles, like it's like, oh, that's so fun, so much, right? Like how like kind of take us through the evolution of how you got there. Like you gave us some insight as to your mindset, right? Like I'm 120 miles into my second 200-mile race in 3 weeks, and I'm gonna go do 300 miles. Like I want to figure out how to do these two races back to back. Like that's a lot, but like where does it start? Like I think we've known each other for quite some time, and you weren't always an ultra runner. Like where did this begin? Like what took you to like, okay, let's go do 300 miles?
Well, there's obviously a couple. Like, I mean, I've had this question before, and I've thought a long hard about it. And there's actually some pivotal moments that uh, were really key things in my life that made it open a door. Let's say it opened my mindset for what's possible. Like it shifted my mindset. And so when I was working in the telecommunications business, and I was out assigned to Manhattan, New York, and I was working out there, and I've always been into fitness, and I had started to run just for I guess to lose weight. Let's say it that way. You know, I lifted weights, but also I wanted to add in more cardio to trim up,
Yeah.
and so that's how I started to do smaller runs. And I think by that time, my longest run in New York had been like 6 miles,
And this was how
and
long ago?
and this was like 2000. I would have to say like nine, probably.
Okay. Okay.
So it's a bit ago, and so here I am out in Manhattan, and I happened to venture into the city the same weekend as the New York City Marathon. I had no clue that it was the New York City Marathon. I just kind of went in and ended up going to the expo. You know, I was walking around down through Manhattan, and I just came across the expo, and so I was like, this is cool. So I went inside and kind of went around the exhibits and stuff, and I found myself in a booth with just with a bunch of books, and it was called Run by Dean Karnazes. And I actually just like walked into the booth, and I'm standing there looking at the book, and I'm reading the back of the book to see what it's about and stuff like that, just burning time. And this guy walks up to me. Actually, it was Dean, the guy that wrote the book, and he's like, "Hey," he's like, "are you interested in buying the book? And if you do, I'll sign it. But if you're not, I'm just going to need you to kind of step out of the booth because we actually have a book signing." And I turned to my right, and there's a huge line. I was totally oblivious. I just like walked in front of everybody before it even started. They're all lined up to do a meet and greet with the author. And Dean Karnazes, to give your viewers a background, he's in in the running community called the Ultra Marathon Man, and he's kind of like one of the I wouldn't even say founding because it goes back to the history of time of running, but in these like the 80s and 90s,
He was an early popular name in the ultra running
yes, and he
community,
was
right?
one of the
Like,
first to
yeah.
start writing books
Yeah.
about ultra running. And so I was just like, I kind of felt bad, but at the same time, I was like, hey, here's the author. And he had a Western States jacket on. And at the time, I was living in Washington, but prior to that, I moved from Forest Hill, California. And in Forest Hill, California is the center of the Western States 100
Yep.
race. And so I learned about this race, and he had that jacket on. I was like, oh, I know that race. And so this guy's obviously finished a pretty profound race. You
Yep.
know, I had no clue who he was. And so I just kind of like, hey, it's $20. I paid the $20, had him sign the book, took a picture with him, and, moved on, you know? So back at the hotel, I had nothing else to do except for read the book in like 2 days. And basically, the premise of the book is talking about his journey in ultra running and how, he's trying to encourage others that just go out and do it. Have the courage to just do it. Anybody's capable of this. You just have to start. That's really the premise of his message. And it sat in my mind for like 2 years. Could I possibly do this? So that was one big major seed planted, was meeting Dean, reading his book, and starting this like running journey. And it kind of planted a seed of, could I do that? But at that time, that goal of 100 miles or whatever was way beyond. I mean, way beyond that I could even think. I like barriers. I threw up barriers. There's no way that I could do this. These people are different. I have no clue. Like I don't even like running. Like let alone like even that my 6 miles that I've done. I thought that was stupid. Like why do people even do this? And so that was a big, like there. So it sat, it didn't like, I didn't just go out the next day and run and go, oh, I'm inspired. It took
Yeah.
about 2 years of self contemplating, self doubting, trying to get the courage up. Well, I moved to Utah and ended up meeting, and actually, I believe, and this is kind of interesting, but your wife was part of the Wrangler group that I kind of just met through a Facebook group here in Utah, and I started to go on some training, like morning training, early morning training runs on the trails, because I was like, I just and they were the shorter stuff, but I wanted to learn a little bit more about trail running and getting in shape, and I liked the community. Well, all these people kept talking about the distances that they were running. And I was just like, well, these people are no different than me, but they're talking about their 50 mile or their 100 mile. And at this time, my longest distance was 12 miles that I ran.
Yeah.
Like not even official marathon race, just I was just ran for 12 miles kind of a thing. And so I ended up, I'm going to try to speed up the process, but I ended up getting the courage over a 3-year period from the time I read Dean's book to actually signing up for my first ultra event of a 50K, which is 31 miles. And I went and ran it up in Spokane, Washington, and I finished it. And I'm like, all right, I finished 31 miles. It's the hardest thing I ever did. I was like, never again kind of a thing. This is stupid. Like, but I can say that I ran an ultra marathon. I'm an ultra marathoner officially,
There you go.
And so, and I had like, I mean, obviously there was a little desire. I wonder if I could go farther, but realistically, I was kind of destroyed by how bad that hit. And I was like, I couldn't imagine going up to 50 miles or beyond. And so come a year later, I get a message on Facebook from a friend from high school. And this friend has a coworker that has a daughter-in-law that lives in Georgia. Now, she's going to come from Georgia over to Lake Tahoe to run the very first Tahoe 200. The very first year is 2014.
Yeah.
So 2013, I ran my first 50K. So it took 4 years from reading the book pretty much to like executing that event. It was like a 3 or 4 year process.
Yep.
And so she knew that I ran this 50 mile, I was doing this trail running. And so she was like, reached out to me. She said, hey, I have this coworker that has this daughter-in-law that's coming out to Tahoe and needs pacers. Now, again, for your viewers, pacers are someone that joins the runner on a shorter segment of their race to kind of make sure that they're a safety runner, like somebody to
Yep.
run with them and be a guide.
Yeah. So they'll
Uh,
usually run along with you for anywhere from 7 to 25 miles, depending on the segments or
yeah,
what the race is or whatever that might be. And they're full of energy because they're coming in fresh and they can make sure that you continue to eat and fuel, etc. Right? So yeah,
Yep.
pacers are a lifesaver in the ultra running community for
Yeah, it's
sure.
part of that serving others. You know, you're
Yep.
serving, you're helping, you're giving some of your time to help others achieve their goal. And so she reached out and asked if I'd be interested in helping, and I said, oh man, yeah, of course, because I grew up in Reno. I grew up hiking all around Lake Tahoe. I'm very familiar with the area, and I had another buddy that I do backcountry skiing with that is actually going out to do the race himself. And so I go out there and we're going over to race check-in to check in for this race. And she asked me, she's like, hey, Ben, and we hadn't really talked online. It was very casual. I just knew the dates and when to be out there, but she never really asked me any questions. And so I get out there and she's just like, hey, Ben, how many hundreds have you ran? Or like, what's the farthest distance you ran? And I was like, well, I've only ran 30 miles. And she had this really stressful look in her face. And she looked over at her husband, and we're just driving there. And he's like, hey, babe, it's going to be all right. Don't worry. And I'm like, what am I missing here? Like, what's going on? And she's like, well, I had like 4 to 5 pacers lined up, and you're the only one that could show up. Everybody else canceled on me.
So she's
So,
hoping you can pace a lot more than you were planning on it.
well, she had 140 miles that she could have a pacer join her, and she was
Yeah.
hoping to have someone join her. And so she has to do the first 60 by herself. And so, well, I'm like looking at her like, well, I'm sorry, but I mean, I'm good for 30. I know I'm good for 30. You know, I've been there. I'm comfortable with that. I've seen it before. I'm
Yeah.
familiar.
Yeah.
And so,
I don't
you know,
like it, but I've been there.
yeah, it was tough. Yeah. So she kind of like, well, okay. So, and to speed up the process, so I get in. So she comes in at mile 60, and I'm like about to join her. She goes, okay, Ben, this is what, and this is the first time ever pacing anybody. And, she's like, what I need you to do is I need you to tell me when to like every 5 minutes, I want you to tell me to take a drink. Every 15 minutes, I want you to tell me to eat. And when I do these things, you do them too. You take a drink, you eat. And I'm like, all right, I can do that. So I'm just like, I'm the timekeeper, you know,
Yep.
and the storyteller. She goes, when I tell you to shut up, shut up. When I tell you to talk to me, you know, kind of a
Yep.
thing. And so, you know, here I go. And I'm just like, you know, like kind of like a cartoon with the dog just bouncing around and all piss and vinegar and just happy and go lucky. And she's kind of, you know, worn down and worn out. But we went off, and in the end, when she finished the 200-mile race, I ended up running 93 miles with her. So there's a big pivot point for me.
Yeah.
So I was so focused on her that I forgot things about me. I just did what I was told. Okay. And she gave me insight. I didn't know it, but she gave me some really valuable insight on how to properly fuel and how to properly hydrate, you know, for the distance. And if you would have asked me, if she would have asked me when we were headed over there, and I told her I ran 30 miles, and she goes, well, I'm going to need you to run 93. If she would have told me those numbers, I would have
Well,
freaked out.
that's 3x. That's a massive jump, right? Like
That's a
you're going
massive jump.
like that's the 3x anything you've ever done to that point. Like how uh, like obviously you weren't thinking about it, but did you feel like you were trained for it at all? Like what
No,
physics
no.
like
For like, I was worried about the 30 miles. I was worried
yeah.
about when she told me that there was like the most of the segments were 20 miles long. I was like, I'm good for 1.5. You know, I don't know what
Yeah.
we're gonna do with that second half of that second. Like, hopefully there's a road I can hitchhike or something like that. But at the time, I was like, I'm good for till I'm not good. You know, and
Right.
I would have I would have freaked out. You know, that massive 3 times jump of what I've done. You know, but in the end, I went 3 times farther than I had ever done, and I actually got to witness other people running because you know, obviously there's about, you know, 100 there at that year. There was about 100 racers, and they came from every shape, size, age, and walk of life.
Sure.
And a lot of them were not as in shape as I was. and they were completing it. And so seeing and witnessing someone else complete something and me doing almost half the distance, I instantly got a huge shift in my mindset and a dump of confidence that I want to do this race. I want to run around Lake Tahoe. I want to run 200 miles. Could I possibly do that? And within like 4 weeks after me pacing that 93 miles, I had already emailed the race director and signed up for the next year's Tahoe 200 because I wanted to see if I was capable of doing that. And that
Yeah, I
was a
think there's
huge shift.
yeah, I think there's a couple things there, right? Like one, you saw other people do it, and so you're like, okay, this is doable, right? This is possible. And I think that's one of the things that we see in our lives, right? Is like they're the dreamers that go out and lead out and do things that haven't been done before. And then there are those of us that see other people do it and we're like, okay, I can do that, right? Like I can make that happen. And as we see within the business community, right? Like a lot of people are doing great things and accomplishing great things, starting wonderful companies, etc., because they're seeing other people do it. And it's amazing to see how much younger that demographic has become in starting up companies, right? Because kids are on their phones, they're in technology when they're in middle school, elementary school, right? Like, okay, I can go be a coder, I can develop I can develop an app, right? Like I can build this because they've seen other people do it, and it just becomes younger and younger. Kind of take us through. So as you've taken us through your journey, oh, the second thing on that is going 90 miles. One, I think your body was somewhat acclimated to at least going long distance. 30 miles is still a pretty long distance, right? And but then you also slowed the pace down. You probably
Yeah,
didn't run that 90 plus miles nearly as fast as you ran that 31 the year before.
exactly.
It was a lot slower because she's pacing to go 200 miles. And so it's a lot slower of a pace. You're probably stopping longer. There's more breaks, right? Like there's a lot of things like that at play. And that's one thing that I always noticed when I was running a lot. And like I came back from the Pacific Northwest, a trip with my family, and I was talking to a coworker at the time. This was post ultra. I was working some other job, and she was like, "Oh, how was your trip?" Blah blah blah. I was like, "Yeah, I did this awesome run across Olympic National Park. It was 26 miles." She's like, "You just ran 26 miles across Olympic National?" I was like, "Yeah." Like to me, that was normal at the point because I had been like having started ultra, having been in the ultra community now for 8 years at that point, right? Like it's like, yeah, that wasn't a big deal. But she's like, how did you do that? And I just sat back and thought about it. I'm like, well, my body just knew how to do it. It had done the distance before, right? Like I didn't train for it specifically, but my body was acclimated to doing hard things. And I think that's a powerful, just kind of a testament to like, okay, once we push our body to these certain thresholds, it can go further. um, but talk to us, kind of walk us through, like, how does this translate to other things, right? Like, you go out and you speak, you're a motivational speaker. I know you've got some things in the works. We can talk about those as far as like building some brands, some products, right? Like some of these other things. But how does pushing your body, how does achieving these things translate into the other areas of your life?
Well, I think you were just, kind of explaining it and being spot on when you're talking about business and entrepreneurs and younger and younger people kind of catching the vision and seeing other people do it. And one, you start to see what makes them different, like what's so special about them. Once you realize everybody's trying to figure it out, just like a running. So whether it's business or whether it's running, everybody's problem solving and trying to figure out. The first thing to do is, believe in yourself that your goal is possible. Once you believe in yourself and once you want your goal, like your driving force, it's going to motivate you to go out and achieve it. And it comes down to like courage. Just start. Everybody wants to know all the right steps to be successful before they start. They want the recipe spelled out, the measurements, how much to put in this and how much to do of this before they even start, so that they're scared of failure. That's what it is. They're scared of not succeeding the very first time and labeling themselves as a failure, or their identity is now they're a failure because they weren't successful. If you can just push that aside and start and say, I'm going to figure it out as I go, I would say 99.9% of entrepreneurs and businesses out there are figuring it out as they go, and they're starting the process. And there's no better place to gain experiences is while preparing to be successful, working towards it. So it wasn't that I signed up for that 200-mile race the next year in 2015 and then didn't do anything and showed up come race day expecting to finish a 200-mile race.
Yeah.
What I had to, like, day in and day out, train. I had to increase my distance on a base level of what my weekly and monthly volume was. I signed up for a bunch of little races and gain experiences there. I started dialing in my nutrition and on a daily basis. And there was races that led up to the 200-mile race that I was did really well in, and then there are some that I had really poor experiences and made some bad critical decisions, but I learned from them. I gained experiences and I self-reflected, and then I altered what I needed to do to prevent it from happening again, so that I could go a little bit farther and a little bit faster and be more prepared. And so that preparation process leading up to be prepared to execute my goal gained me the experience to be successful. And so the same thing within business is, getting the courage, believing in yourself is the first thing, starting. Then it comes down to being consistent, actively, like every day working towards your goals, setting small milestones and achieving those and gaining that momentum. And then focusing in your effort on a daily basis, becoming more efficient, trying to, the more efficient, the more capacity you can fit in a day, and the faster you can grow, and the farther you get. And then I would say patience is being patient to see out the goal. I think more entrepreneurs, more runners, more people in life give up on their goals and dreams because they're not patient. They're not
Yeah.
patient to see it through. They run into a hurdle or an obstacle that looks very difficult to work through, and they give up and they walk away from it and just say, oh, it's not for me, or it's impossible. You ask anybody that's super successful in business, is they're going to talk about a few different projects that they were completely utter failures at. But they learned, they pivoted, and they continued to move forward. And they patiently pursued and endured those challenges, figured them out and remedied them, and then became successful. So patience is probably I think the number one killer of people's goals after they've gotten the courage to start is they want it now and they want it fast, and they're not willing to, see it through to the end.
Yeah, I think that's sage advice, right? Like patiently pursue, right? Like a couple things, like there's a lot there that we could unpack, right? One of the things that I think about is happy accidents. And as we patiently pursue, the happy accidents come, right? Your story of like going 90 plus miles with her in the Tahoe 200, like that's kind of a happy accident. Because if you would have paced her for 30 miles, you would have probably never signed up for Tahoe 200. But
No.
it was the fact that you had gone 90 miles without really recognizing it, which I know for most of us is like, is that really accurate? Like, is that true? But having seen it, right, like you get in the mode of just helping someone else. You're outward focused, which is a powerful lesson in that as well, right? And that happy accident just happens, right? Like when we started Ultra, like it was kind of a happy accident, the timing of it, right? Like yeah, the timing of it was 2019. It was in the middle of the recession. It was a bad time to start any company, but there was also the happy accident of like, okay, while after we had got started, Christopher McDougall released his book Born to Run. There was kind of this barefoot minimalist craze. People were thinking outside the traditional footwear box, and looking for other options, right? And so there was this happy accident that occurred. You talked a lot about failure in that last statement, and just the patience to overcome failure. What would you consider is kind of your biggest failure?
Oh man, I have failures all the time. It's just, but from a biggest failure, I would have to say my biggest failures have been my biggest pivotal growth moments as well. And that's something I share with a lot of people, like in my speaking, because one thing, you dream big, especially if you're going to start you start a company or something like that. You have big dreams. You have dreaming big, and you're like, you might be, obviously, if you're doing it right, you're sharing what you're doing, you're sharing with others, you're getting, people excited about it and everything like that. And then if it doesn't go your way and you fall flat on your face, it's a big moment of, are you going to get back up and continue forward, or are you going to about face and go the other direction, kind of thing? What are you going to do with it? And that's what. And so there was one year, and so just like that Wasatch Tahoe idea, I had a crazy idea. I did this race in Europe that became, I learned about it, and then I did it, and then I learned that it was one of the 5 hardest races of this race series. And one of the races of the other 5 races was running the entire distance across the Pyrenees. And from one side, the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, on the border of France and Spain. And so it being almost 500 miles. And I was like, oh, that sounds awesome. I want to do that race next. And so I started to follow the race information, the race director, getting on the website, getting the emails, joining the group, and getting the information. Well, the year that I was going to do it, the race had to be canceled because of some issues with permitting from the year before that they had to resolve with some things. So basically it was canceled.
Yeah.
So I sat there and was bummed out. But at this time, I had already done that Wasatch Tahoe. I created it. I got this courage and this, I can do, why do I need a race to run across the Pyrenees? Because they have towns, they have refugios, they have all these different places. Why can't I just do it myself, and make it, and maybe how fast has someone ever done it? And what support did they use? And so in our community of running, there's things called FKTs, which is the fastest known time. And that's a particular route and who's the fastest human to ever complete it and document it. And so I started doing some research on that. So I built up a project called the Pyrenees Project. I was raising money, decided to raise money for an organization. I started to get sponsorship to help cover the logistics and the travel costs. I had a film crew that jumped in. University wanted to do some testing on me while I ran across this. It started to become a really public, big thing.
Yeah.
And I was really, really excited about it. And this was definitely stepping out of my, comfort zone. At this time, I'd only ran 300 miles, and now I'm going up to 500 miles. And so I go over there to do it.
Self-supported at that, essentially.
It was a self-supported effort, where I planted caches along the way. So we showed up a week early to drive across the Pyrenees and plant stashes of gear and nutrition so that I could run across.
Yeah.
And we get to the start, and I get almost 24 hours into the race. So we're at the beginning of the race. I'm, roughly 60 plus miles in. And during this section, we're on the lower altitude, like the foothills of these Pyrenees mountains. And the cool thing about the Pyrenees is they have multiple springs that run year round. And I did my research. I had all this information. I mean, I was researching forever. One piece of information that I missed was on the lower elevations, the natural springs run off of rainfall. And leading up to this, when I started my event, they had over a week of a heat wave with no rain. I didn't I didn't
So
check the weather.
there was no spring when you needed water.
So I get, 20, 30 miles into this and I started hitting water sources that I was counting on and there was no springs.
Yeah.
There's no water.
Yeah,
And
that's
in
rough.
fact, the heat wave was still in effect. And so here I am in this humid climate, no water. All the food that I had on me was dehydrated meals, freeze dried from local sponsor. My nutrition was powders that went into your water. Everything pivoted on water. Water
Yeah.
was the main source, and I
Yeah.
was not hitting water. And so I hit a point where I had to keep moving forward without water. And I ended up going in almost a whole 50 kilometers with, 30 miles without any water. I started cramping. I would get to a point where I had to like lay down on the trail. I ended up getting to a town where the camera crew was going to film me coming through, and I was I was in a bad place. I had heat exhaustion. I ended up having to, and this is something you're allowed to do on self-support. I was able to check into a hotel, like a little hotel, to get out of. I needed some rest. I needed to
Yeah.
take like and try to remedy this heat exhaustion. And so I ate food. I, brought my temperature down. I slept. I got up the next morning and I continued on, and it was not a good scenario. My heart rate was still going way high without little effort. The whole thing just blew up. So I was going for this major, major run, had this huge project, and I completely fell on my face. Let me just say, I had to pull the plug. Like I was in no condition. It took me about 3 days to recover from that heat exhaustion to function. There's no way that I was going to continue on and move an
Yeah.
average of 60 miles a day with roughly 30,000 feet of vert per day.
No, that's rough. Put all the wheels in motion, get everything set
Yep.
up, like go across the Pyrenees to set up all of your caches, and then 60 miles in, pull the plug, right? Like even after trying to recover, it's hard to come back. Like, and that's the thing about running, right? Like once you've fallen into a deficit like that, it's really hard to come back, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes you like if it's a mental deficit, you can usually work out of it, but that's the importance of hydrating and new proper nutrition, right? Like, and it plays such a big part. So that's tough. Those, but how much did you learn from that, right? Like
Yeah.
you learn,
That's
okay, now
the
I got to do more research than I thought I needed to do to make sure that I've got everything squared away, right? Because you could have, like, knowing what you know now, okay, I could have had more water caches set out, right? Like I could have had more sources of water, knowing that the sources of water weren't available. And then, okay, then I probably could have pushed on and completed it. But um, yeah, it's yeah things like yeah we can control it. We can try and control for everything, but sometimes things outside of our control happen and can throw us for a loop. And but that hasn't caused you to give up on extreme endurance events, right? Like you attempted the AZT, the Arizona Trail, a couple of years ago, and again another unsuccessful attempt. But as we talked before, like you're gonna go try it again. Like
Yep.
and it's still on the list as much as it sounds like you love the desert trail.
Yeah.
But
So,
we,
like going from that Pyrenees, I went back home and I totally reanalyzed everything. I changed a ton of things up that has actually made me, if I would have been successful, I probably wouldn't have changed anything. I
yeah,
would have stayed the same.
yeah,
So, but by the like falling on my face, I had to make some changes. There were some pretty apparent chinks in my armor and weaknesses in my chain. And so going back and repairing those things and making those changes, I became actually even a better, more powerful athlete that's led to, you know, bigger accomplishments today. And so if I I've been asked one time on another podcast is if would I change any of my failures in the past? And I would say no, because my failures are what has made me who I am today. I had, um, I guess that comes down to each individual person, like how they responded to their failure. That might be the determining factor on if you would have changed or not. And because I feel like my response was for the better and for a growing opportunity, I would never change that, because those were my biggest growth points in my life,
Yeah.
are around my failures and not my successes.
Yeah, and I think like that's powerful, right? Like as we take our failures, we need to learn and grow from them, right? I always I always turn kind of go cross-eyed when I hear the Michael Jordan story about how he was cut from his high school basketball team, because when you fact check it, okay, yeah, he was cut as a freshman. He was a freshman in high school. Then he was cut from his high school basketball team. Like, okay. But what that failure did for him was it caused him to go and like have this like morning like I suck moment, but his dad kicked him in the butt and said, "No, like go back, work harder and you'll make the team." And that's what he did. And he learned just the work ethic that needed to really go into being a great player, right? Like, yeah, we all have skills, we all have talents, we all have abilities, but if we don't put in the work ethic, if we don't overcome and bounce back from our failures, we're not going to experience these big successes. Ben, I want to fire off some quick rapid fire questions. You can
Sure.
take as long as you want to answer them if you need to. Um, but let's kind of move through these. I'll rapid fire them. I'll let you answer. I won't add any commentary, but I just want like let's get into your psyche a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this. But so first off, what frightens you?
Getting old.
Fair enough. What inspires you?
The like the pot like the possibility of what's on the other side of the mountain. So like what's at the top of that summit, and whether that the summit is a not a it's a figure of
Yeah,
speech. It's like what is truly possible. I think that we're limitless, and like where like my whole uh business is built, like my motto is venture your potential. And what is my potential? And I think it's limitless. So how far can I get before I kick the bucket?
yeah. No, I think that's fair. I will add a little commentary, just a little caveat to that. Sometimes we are limited by our physical like injuries, certain things along those. Right, there are sometimes limits per se that are like I was a huge proponent of when we had this tagline zero limits to ultra, right? Like I do think that we can push beyond what we think is capable, but we also have to understand too sometimes that like if you do end up pushing yourself to certain limits, it could be detrimental to your health. I have Achilles tendonitis right now, and I'm fighting through that. The last thing I want to do is fight too hard that I snap an Achilles, right? Like, so there are some that like we are limitless to a limit a little bit, right? Fair. Um, and you probably argue with me on that a little bit, but that's okay. But what gives you hope for the future?
I believe that humanity is good.
Awesome. I love it. What is something that you would want to tell your 18-year-old self?
Don't be afraid to work harder.
Love it. What book are you reading right now?
Oh, I just finished Cameron Haynes' Endure. I haven't started a new one just yet, but I literally just finished it this weekend.
Okay. Did you like it? Was it a worthwhile read?
Oh yeah, he's a friend of mine, and it gives me more insight in who and why he is the way he is today.
Cool. Awesome. What book have you read in the past 12 to 18 months that you would highly recommend to others?
Whew. Atomic Habits, Endure. I have
So I've
another
got
buddy.
Atomic Habits right here. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, there is another Endure book, Mindset. Like, I wouldn't say these are probably more than 18 months, but these are big ones that made profound influence on my mindset.
Sure.
And then I have a buddy down in LA that has a book out called Mask, and it was very interesting to read as well. about the Hollywood lifestyle and popularity lifestyle and how they live their lives with a mask on and taking the
Oh,
mask
interesting.
off.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think sometimes when we get in the limelight, right? Like we don't want to reveal our true selves. And
exactly.
then we start to deal with a little like, who am I really? Right?
Ex-
There's definitely some aspects to that.
yeah.
What's your favorite place you've traveled and why?
Favorite so far? Oh man, the Pyrenees for sure. Oh my
Okay.
gosh, Andorra is really cool. Anything along the Pyrenees, like where they do the Tour de France, is super spectacular. And then the next was the Azores off of Portugal.
Okay.
Um, I'm actually that's my heritage is from the Azores. That's where my some grandfather or grandmother were both from. And when I took my dad back there a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and it was incredible to see things that were like from the 800s or thousands,
Yeah.
like paintings and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
actually know that's over 1,000 years old. It's pretty incredible.
No,
I
it's
like
fascinating. Europe is fascinating because it is so
old
old, right?
stuff. I like
Like
history.
here in the US, we don't comprehend old
Yep,
because the oldest buildings here were built in like the 15th and 16th century. Well, really the 16th century, whereas over there a lot of stuff built in the 5th and 6th centuries, right? Like
exactly.
so yeah, it's fascinating. Well, that's awesome. Ben, it's been a pleasure. To wrap it up, let us know what else are you working on? Like I know you've got a couple of big things in the works. What does that look like? And
Me and my buddy Mike that I've mentioned before, we're about to launch an event company next year. Hopefully, that's our goal. Adventure. It's called Great Western Adventures. It's just we're gonna have some new exciting races here in the local Utah area that's all tied into the Great Western Trail. And then I'm hoping to start in a gear company as well, called FKT Sports. And
awesome.
it's just I have a bunch of ideas, let's say that way. Another thing that I think of while I'm running, and some products, and I see some holes in the market that could be filled and have great benefit for other runners. So I have a couple ideas and see if we kick off a Kickstarter to see how well it does.
Awesome. Good for you. Well, how can people follow you or keep in touch with what you're doing?
Best way to follow me is adventure.your.potential on Instagram. That will link over to just Ben Light over on Facebook. And then my website should be completely finished in the next about month. And that's adventureyourpotential.com.
Awesome, Ben. Well, thanks for your time today. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Appreciate you having me on.